So I'd like to welcome you all to ESIG's first long-term load forecasting workshop. And we're really excited to bring this special topic workshop to you all. Incredibly hot topic. It urgently needs a lot more attention, a lot more work. And we're really excited to have the opportunity to do this today. So as you all know, loads, the days of flat or declining load growth appear to be over. So loads used to look like, let's see if this works, look like this across the continental United States. And with electrification and new loads like hydrogen, we're expecting massive load growth, maybe double, maybe more. We expect electrification of other sectors is going to change the nature of load. Maybe peak demand is going to move to the winter instead of the summer. Maybe we'll see more variability in load. And here's some snapshots of what some folks are seeing around the globe. So this snapshot here on the left is from MISO's Electrification Insight Study. They looked at 3 scenarios of electrification. Their high scenario predicts load growth of 70% by 2040. So, increases in hot water heating, HVAC load growth, industrial and commercial heating, and electric vehicles, of course. This transforms MISO from a summer to a winter peaking system. It changes their periods of risk. It affects their resource adequacy, their capacity accreditation, planning on the transmission and the distribution systems. This goes all the way down to questions of things like when you do maintenance on your generators. This graphic right here from S&P Global, this is just looking at load in the Permian Basin. So this is just West Texas in the Permian Basin where there's a lot of oil and gas development. And some of that oil and gas development is expected to be electrified, and they're finding something like 15 to 20 gigawatts of new load growth just in this area. ERCOT, this is out in West Texas, ERCOT's peak load is 80 gigawatts. So this is a significant amount of load growth. And then hydrogen. This is data from McKinsey. They're tracking some 680 large scale hydrogen projects globally. This chart is just looking at the gigawatt scale production facilities. So we're looking at huge factors that are going to be affecting load. I want to give a brief overview of the workshop for the next few days. We're very lucky to have this morning a keynote by Professor Jenkins at Princeton, who's going to provide a foundation for the workshop and show the impact of policies on the future grid. Then John Black from ISO New England is going to talk about how load forecasting is done today by planners at utilities. And then we have session 1 on weather and climate. And we're going to talk about different approaches to incorporating forward-looking climate impacts into our load, wind, solar, weather data sets, so we can build these forward-looking trends into our planning. After lunch, we have a session on transportation electrification. So we'll talk about EV adoption, use cases, charging profiles. And then the last session today on flexibility. So what kind of flexibility are we going to need in the future power system? What is customer response today? What kind of flexibility can we get from new large loads? And finally, don't miss the networking reception. That's what the little badges in your name tag are for. So then tomorrow, we're going to start off with industrial loads and hydrogen. We're going to talk about data centers, thermal heat batteries, hydrogen. And then we'll talk about heat pumps, water heaters, what happens to these technologies when it gets really cold, then distributed solar and storage, and then distribution planning. How do you disaggregate bulk power system forecast down to the distribution level, or how do you bottom up forecast from, say, the premise level? And then the last day is going to be really a super session of everything that we've talked about the first 2 days. And it's about how everything fits together. And we've got some case studies to discuss with you. And then also we've got some consultants who are going to be discussing best practices. So a little bit of logistics real quick. you can go freely between this workshop and the markets and meteorology workshop. Just try to be quiet when you're moving back and forth. We're going to be recording everything. It's going to be posted on our YouTube channel. The PDFs will be posted on our website. I'd like to welcome those of you who are first timers to an ESIG event. So if you have never come to an ESIG event before, stand up. Just curious how many of you, oh, wow. Wow, okay, that's awesome. That's great. Well, for those of you who are sitting, I want to ask to, make sure you meet and greet the folks who are standing, learn what they're working on, introduce yourselves. I wanted to say, the networking, the coffee breaks, the discussions over a beer after the sessions are over, that's what makes these events special. That's where a lot of the learning happens, not just in the presentations. Don't be afraid to ask questions. We're all learning here. So for those of you who are new, we are having a fall workshop and a spring workshop later this year and early next year that are more general workshops. So this is a special topic, but the fall and spring workshops cover everything from resource adequacy to transmission to building electrification to inverter-based resources and grid forming inverters. Also, I wanted to say for those of you who are new and who may not be members of ESIG, one of the things that we do at ESIG is we work together in working groups and in task forces, and we try to address common problems in the industry. So we come together under different topical areas and try to bring up best practices or maybe do some analysis and some modeling to fill some gaps that aren't being addressed in industry, or try to, further some area or maybe bring some cross-cutting folks together. I bring this up because Josh Novacek, who leads the system planning working group, is planning to start a long-term load forecasting task force after this workshop is done. And so, those who are interested, pin him down. Josh, are you here? Oh yeah, that guy right there. Pin him down and ask to be involved. Other things, we also have user groups, and those are for like utility users of different aspects of things. So like grid enhancing technologies is for transmission utilities, probabilistic forecasts and planning and operations is for utility planners and operators. Quick disclaimer and antitrust guidelines, don't go making a $10 million investment decision off something you heard someone say at ESIG, solely off that. Antitrust guidelines, please avoid any conduct that unreasonably restrains competition. And then finally, we don't tolerate any discrimination or any harassment. We ask everybody, please be respectful to each other. And with that, I am now going to bring up Professor Jesse Jenkins. He's a professor at Princeton University in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and in the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. He leads the Princeton Zero Lab, which you may have heard of, as well as the Repeat Project, which I think is just an amazing project because it allows him to do a lot of analysis quickly of policies as they're changing in real time in DC, and to help all of us understand what the implications of those policies are. And then also you may be aware of Princeton's Net Zero America study, and he was a principal investigator and lead author of that study. So we are very pleased today to have Jesse join us. And if I can just, whoops. Oh, all right. Sorry. I should.
You're okay. You're okay.
All right.
Okay. Great. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm excited to be able to join you today. I'm in the neighborhood for the International Energy Workshop over in Golden this week, so I was excited to be able to come down this morning and join you. I want to talk some stage setting for the rest of the conversation throughout the day and talk about the grid that we're going to need to decarbonize the United States energy system. So I want to start here. I hope this is starting to sink in for folks, but I start basically all of my talks here, which is that thanks to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law in the last Congress, we have seen a really momentous shift in the overall economic environment and policy environment in the United States for the energy sector. And the reason for that is that something like the full financial might of the federal government is now aligned behind a clean energy transition, right? This has really never been the case before. We've had on again, off again policies for individual technologies like the solar ITC or the wind PTC that expire at inopportune moments. We've had states, of course, stepping out and leading, whether that's Colorado or California or New Jersey or elsewhere, but in a very fragmented manner, right, with nothing at the national level. We've had failed efforts at the federal level in 2009, 2010 to pass a comprehensive climate program, and really nothing since then for over a decade. And now with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in particular, and also the infrastructure law, effectively the federal government has put clean energy on sale, right? These laws don't attempt to regulate or constrain carbon dioxide emissions directly. They don't attempt to price carbon. What they do is put the thumb of Uncle Sam heavily on the scale on the clean side of every investment or purchasing decision, right, relative to dirty technologies. So whether that's an electric utility deciding what they want to source for their new electricity supply, or a fleet manager at Amazon trying to decide what kind of medium duty vans they need to buy to deliver their packages, or you and I thinking about how we want to heat our homes. Basically, everything that you might want to put into a clean energy economy or clean energy system is now somewhere between 10 and 65% off, right? So go shopping, right? This fundamentally changes millions of economic decisions that everyone across the economy is going to make, and it simply makes the cleaner option the better financial decision, right? So it sort of removes the tension between doing the right thing and doing the economic thing. Now, of course, there's different levels of strength for some of these subsidies. Some are better calibrated than others, but it's important to note how comprehensive this is, right? It cuts across all sectors of the economy, all of the major components of a clean energy system. That includes, of course, long-term tax credits for clean electricity sources for all carbon-free electricity now, not a specific list of technologies, but after 2025, any carbon-free electricity generation technology can receive either the PTC or the ITC, whichever one is most advantageous. And unlike the short-term, extensions that we've seen in the past, those credits will be available at full strength for projects that commence construction through the end of either 2033 or the year after the United States cuts greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector to 75% below 2022 levels, whichever comes later, right? So it's likely that means that projects that commence construction through the middle of the 2030s and come online through the end of the 2030s will be receiving the full value of the PTC or ITC, providing long-term investment certainty that we've never had before. Now, of course, on the demand side, we also see a range of incentives for electric vehicle adoption, right? So if you're personal vehicles, new vehicles can receive up to $7,500 tax credit. Starting next year, that will be transferable to the seller at the point of sale. So if you don't want to wait till April to file your taxes, or maybe you don't actually have $7,500 in tax liability to offset, the dealer can claim the credit on your behalf and take that off the purchase price of the vehicle. Now, there are sourcing requirements for those that are intended to help onshore battery production and materials production in the United States. There's also a commercial EV tax credit that I think is underappreciated that covers any business use of electric vehicle adoption, also worth up to $7,500, worth exactly $7,500 for light duty vehicles with no domestic sourcing requirements, and that includes all leased vehicles. So if you're concerned that there's a tension between the industrial policy and the effort to roll out EVs, don't be so concerned, because anybody who doesn't qualify for the domestic sourcing requirements can lease vehicles, and the value of the credit can be passed along to customers in lower lease prices. Now, that also importantly covers medium and heavy duty vehicles, up to $40,000 per vehicle, or 30% of the purchase cost, or whatever the incremental cost is relative to a fossil vehicle, again, whichever's lower there. So that's critical. I'm already starting to see Rivian Amazon delivery vans around my neighborhood. This will fundamentally change the economic calculus for businesses when thinking about what kind of vehicles to put in a rental car fleet or put into a delivery fleet, or even long haul trucking, or port, dryage vehicles, et cetera. This fundamentally lowers the cost and makes very financially conscious business entities much more likely to rapidly adopt EVs. On the building side, we do see, of course, tax credits for electrification, really for a whole range of things. These are much more aggressive and expanded than they were before. It's up to $2,000 for heat pump installation, for example. There's tax credits for upgrading electrical panels if that's part of another electrification investment. For those who don't have access to tax or don't own their own homes or can't claim tax credits, there are rebate programs, about $8.5 billion of funding that will go out to states to administer for low and middle income households for either whole home electrification or whole home retrofit programs. So significant efforts to drive uptake of heat pumps and electrification and efficiency in buildings as well. So all of that going on at once is reshaping both the supply side and the demand side. And that's just the electricity piece, right? We've got clean hydrogen credits, carbon capture, all sorts of other additional things in the bill. So Debbie mentioned the repeat project. This is a project that we've been running since the beginning of 2021. Using the toolkit that we developed in the Net Zero America study to model pathways for the whole country to decarbonize the overall energy system. We've automated and updated those procedures so that we could model in as close to real time as possible federal energy policy as it's being debated and hopefully enacted, and give us kind of a real-time look at our progress on the path to net zero. So this is a summary of our latest updated analysis from 2023 of the impacts of the policies passed in the last Congress. This did not yet include the proposed regulations from the EPA, such as tailpipe standards for 2027 and beyond, or the power plant rules that are proposed recently. We're modeling those now, and we'll have results later this late summer or early fall. So of course, folks, I think probably in this room know this, but many don't. We actually have been making progress on emissions. Our emissions peaked between 2005 and 2007 at about 6.6 billion tons, and they've fallen by about 1 billion tons since then. So we have seen some emissions progress sustained over the last decade or so. Based on our repeat project modeling, the trajectory without the laws passed in the last Congress, so a frozen policy scenario as of 2021, had us continuing basically that trend at about 2% per year sustained rate of decarbonization, kind of stalling out in the 2040s. Now, with the passage of the Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we estimate that that will more than double the pace of decarbonization in the United States to somewhere on the order of 4% per year. That gets us to between 37 and 41% below 2001 levels by 2030, and about 50% below 2005 levels by 2035. Now, many of these policies are long-term in the sense of a decade plus, but they most of them begin to expire in 2032. And so, of course, the impact does taper off after 2035. This is not the last climate policy that we're going to have to pass to stay on track. Now, of course, even that historic progress also falls short of the pace that President Biden has committed the country to, and that we would need to be on if we want to reach net zero by 2050, a goal consistent with our global commitments to address the threat of climate change. There, we're targeting a 50% reduction below 2005 levels or peak levels by 2030. We estimate that would require about a 6% per year pace of annual declines in CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. So we have closed a substantial amount of that gap, but we still have more work to do. And of course, there are a variety of non-economic or critical constraints that may limit where we fall across that range of scenarios that we've modeled. So we kind of have a more pessimistic, more optimistic scenarios for the emissions trajectory. Some of that may be closed by pending regulations. We'll have an update on that, as I said, later this year. All right, now there's a lot of numbers, but I think what they really hide for us is the sheer scale of the physical infrastructure and build out that we're talking about. We're talking about really remaking and rebuilding how we make and use energy across the entirety of the economy in a matter of 3 decades. Right? This is a really unprecedented undertaking. So to give a sense of scale and to focus in on what I think the really critical challenge is now, which is not the economics, right? The financial incentives are now in place. The critical challenge for us as a country and as a sector now is how do we mobilize a nation to build energy infrastructure at the scale commensurate with the economic and climate opportunity before us. So to give a sense of what that looks like, this is our total electricity supply mix today. We provide about 4,000 terawatt hours of electricity. And of course, electricity is going to be a linchpin in any of our efforts to decarbonize the economy because it has to accomplish two simultaneous goals, right? It's responsible for about a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions today. So that 60% of our supply now in red and gray is natural gas and coal. That's going to have to be driven down to eventually zero. But of course, we also need to expand the role of electricity in the economy to electrify vehicles and industrial processes and buildings and provide clean fuels like hydrogen. And so we need to be simultaneously growing the amount of electricity supply as we decarbonize it. So what does that look like? This is consistent with our net zero pathway. So this is that 6% per year trajectory that gets us to 50% below peak levels by 2030 and on to net zero. By 2030, the amount of new carbon-free electricity generation that we would have to add to the grid is equal to more than 1.5 times all current carbon-free generation. Right? So we get about 40% of our electricity today from carbon-free sources, just shy of, well, I guess it's about 1,800 terawatt hours. Most of that, the majority of that is existing nuclear and hydro, right? And then we've seen the growing contributions from wind and solar, which is the yellow bit there. So we need to add 1.5 times all current carbon-free generation, and obviously nuclear and hydro are not going to be dramatically expanding over that period. So what that really means is about a 5-fold increase in the installed capacity of wind and solar through the end of the decade. And that's just getting started. By 2035, we would need to add more than the entirety of all US power generation from new carbon-free sources over the next 12-ish years now, right? And then we have to do all of that again, because the growth of electricity demand will lead to a more than doubling, about 150 to 170% increase in total electricity consumption by 2050, meaning that we'll have to add again about 4,000 terawatt hours of additional clean energy supply, clean electricity supply from 2035 to 2050. So, it took us however many years to build our current grid. We could go all the way back to the days of Edison and Tesla, 150 or so years ago. Now we have to build the entirety of that size of power generation twice in the next 30 years, right? So this is an enormous undertaking. And I think that it takes a while for the scale of infrastructure that we're talking about to sink in for folks. But let's look at what that looks like in historical context. So this is all annual capacity additions in the United States power sector since 1950. You can see, of course, the big build out in the 1970s. That was the last time electricity demand was sort of rapidly growing in the US on through the end of the 1980s, really. And then, of course, the deregulation of power and gas markets led to a huge boom in natural gas generation around 2000 to 2005. That's the big gray part there. And then the more rapid, more sustained growth of wind and solar in blue and yellow in recent years. This is what the modeled pathways look like for the net zero pathway that are consistent with adding all of that new carbon-free supply. Over the next decade, through the end of this decade, we need to more than double the peak rate of deployment for wind and solar. So we need to be averaging about 65 gigawatts per year of new wind and solar capacity additions over the next 7 years. And then that needs to grow to about 3.5 times that peak rate from 2031 to 2035. So something like 115 or 120 gigawatts per year of annual capacity additions. Now, of course, that requires smashing new records year in and year out going forward. The good news is that projections from both the EIA, and I just saw another one from the solar industry today, have solar growth actually exceeding this pace of growth, with an expectation of about 50 gigawatts per year of average additions between now and 2027 from an industry source. EIA projects over 40 gigawatts per year, which is more than double the 20 gigawatt peak over the next 2 years. So solar is growing at this pace, at least over the next 5 years, and I would expect that to continue. Wind, unfortunately, has slowed down due to a variety of supply chain constraints and challenges with interconnection and transmission expansion. The growth of wind, as well as I think a hangover from the end of the PTC, which expired before passage of IRA. So we kind of cleared the decks of the pipeline in order to get projects built before the end of the PTC. That pipeline is now being rebuilt, but over the next 2 years, the EIA projects that wind additions will be only about 7 gigawatts per year. That's half of the peak rate that we achieved in 2021 of 15 or 16 gigawatts. So solar on track, wind slowing down. We need to get wind back into the accelerator or the fast lane. To give a visual sense of what that looks like, we take a significant effort to use very geospatially granular data to form up our input data for our macro scale modeling. And then we can unpack that data back down to a geospatial scale and map out one potential way in which that might get built out across the country, right? This isn't a prediction, but it gives you a sense of the scale of physical build out that would be economic and consistent with our macro scale model. So going from bar charts to maps, right? This is our current solar and wind capacity installed, as well as our modeled 2022 calibration year. So this isn't actual 2022 installations, but our modeled installations to get the model going. The blue are existing utility wind farms across the country. And if you look closely, it might be hard to see from the back, there are little orange squares. Those are all the utility solar projects across the country now. This is what that would look like, new additions through the end of the 10 years, 2032. More than doubling over a total installed capacity of wind across the country, the emergence of a large offshore wind industry across the East Coast, and substantial build out of solar really all over the country. And by 2050, it might look something like this, right? So very large scale build out across much of the country. Now, we're already seeing local opposition to build outs in many cases across the country of wind and utility scale solar increasingly. And so how we go about generating social license and community benefits and support for this scale of installation will be critical to see if we can actually stay on this path with wind and solar, or if it'll fall short and we'll need to augment the growth of wind and solar with other carbon-free electricity sources, whether that's natural gas with carbon capture, nuclear, geothermal, or others. All right, of course, we're going to need a bigger grid if we're going to do this too, right? If demand begins growing again for electricity, which it's going to, right? We have seen basically flat demand nationally for electricity since around 2005. We're now going to see a sustained period of demand growth again, something we haven't seen since the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. That alone will require a bigger grid, right? If demand is growing steadily at about 2.5%, 3% per year, we're going to need a larger transmission system to supply that growth. But at the same time, we're going to be dependent on location-specific variable renewable resources, particularly wind power, where we have to build out to the best locations in the country. It's interesting that actually the physical resource base for wind and solar varies by about a factor of 2 from the sort of bottom 20th percentile to the top 20th percentile sites across the country. So solar insolation and wind speeds vary by about a factor of 2. But wind turbines convert wind speeds to wind power output at the wind speed cubed. So the best sites are about 8-fold better than the 20th percentile sites, whereas solar PV, it's only linear, right? It basically is a direct linear conversion of insolation to power output. And so really a lot of transmission is driven by the need to tap the best wind resources because the best ones are a lot better than the mediocre ones. Solar, we have a lot more flexibility, but the sheer scale of solar interconnections will also drive transmission expansion. So we estimated the total amount of transmission gigawatt miles that we might need to build out between now and 2035 to be on pace for the net zero scenario. And it's enough to run from New York to Los Angeles and back 15 times. It's about 75,000 miles of transmission expansion, right? Now that seems pretty darn daunting. It's about a 2.3% per year sustained growth in gigawatt miles of transfer capacity in the US grid. But it's also not entirely unprecedented or impossible. Again, the last time demand grew steadily in the US economy prior to the 2000s, we actually did expand transmission capacity in the country by about 2% per year. So not all that different from the pace that we need to be on if we're going to be on this net zero pathway. On the other hand, over the last decade, we've only grown the transmission system by about 1% per year. So we need to more than double or roughly double the pace of transmission expansion relative to the recent decade. And the stakes are incredibly high. If we fail to do that, we estimate that we would lose about half of the emissions reductions impact of the Inflation Reduction Act. All right, you might have previously heard the stat there was 80% of emissions reductions. That was the result from our preliminary estimates, our revised estimates from 2023. The baseline's a little lower, so there's less reductions from IRA, but we still lose about half of the overall emissions reductions if we can't accelerate the growth of transmission expansion. So this is another central bottleneck or challenge that we need to overcome to take advantage of the clean supply that is out there across the country and is now economic to develop. All right, of course, on the demand side, we're going to be seeing a fundamental shift as well. Again, I said this before, anybody who's been working in this industry for the last 20 years is used to relatively flat demand growth, right? Where we have, growth in the economy or population offset by improvements in energy efficiency and roughly stagnant national demand. If you live in, if you're representing utility or work in Arizona, maybe you're used to demand growth, but most of the country has been stagnant or even declining in parts of the Midwest and Northeast. Again, that's going to change with the growth of EVs. So this is historical EV adoption as a percent of light duty vehicles sold in New Jersey, where I'm from. Each year, this is probably similar to many other states that have proactive state policies to support EVs. We had about 8% of all new sales last year in the state were EVs. That'll probably more than double this year to 16 or 18%. And then if you've been paying attention to the Clean Cars or ZEV, Zero Emissions Vehicle Advanced Clean Cars 2 targets that California has rolled out and a dozen other states are adopting, including New Jersey, this is the implied pace that of sales that would be required to hit to meet that goal. That by 2035, 100% of all new light duty vehicle sales will be electric. All right, so we're seeing this sort of inflection point in EV adoption. We've seen this already in countries that lead us in EV adoption, whether that's China or parts of Europe, Norway, et cetera. And I think we can expect that to come here. These S curves often look like they start slow, and then they take off like a rocket ship. And that's basically what the EV adoption curve is poised for. I think heat pumps are a little bit slower, but on a similar potential trajectory. Now, that is going to drive very different demand patterns as well. So not only is it driving growth, as we saw from Chris Clack's estimates are very similar to what we're showing. This is our estimated demand patterns for circa 2030 in New Jersey for a deep decarbonization pathway study that we published at Zero Lab. And this is what it would look like in 2050, right? Again, with the substantial growth due to both heating electrification and EV adoption of winter demand, but also the summer peak, right? So the summer peak has gone up from about 22 gigawatts to something like 28 or 30. But the winter peak, right, has gone from only 18 gigawatts up to 40 plus, right? So more than double the demand in the winter. Now, this is let's just assume everybody plugs in whenever they want demand, right? I'll come back to demand flexibility in a second. But this is a fundamental shift in how we think about planning, right? So not only are we going back onto a growth footing, but we have to be thinking about shifting and changing demand patterns as well, which I know is a focus of much of your conversation for the rest of this meeting. Now, I want to stress too that we have more time to prepare for this than perhaps the sales charts show, right? Vehicle adoption is, only a portion of the fleet is rolling over every year. Vehicles are actually lasting longer and longer. So this may actually even be optimistic because it's based on historical vehicle longevity, which tends to be increasing, it seems. But if we look at the sales share in blue from our modeled net zero pathways compared to the stock shares in orange, so this is the portion of the actual vehicles on the road that are electric, both light duty here and medium and heavy duty, you can see that it's basically delayed by about a decade in terms of the S curve from the adoption curve. So we have maybe more time than we think. If by 2035, 100% of vehicles sold are electric, we still have until 2045 until maybe 90% of vehicles on the road are electric. So, we have to be anticipating, watching the leading indicators, right, like sales shares, but recognizing that total demand will be driven by stock shares, which will take longer to turn over. And it's the same story for heat pumps, for water heating, or for space heating. The sales shares are the leading indicators, but of course, the demand is driven by the trailing indicator of stock turnover. Now, I want to end here, which is that we have the potential to also unlock incredible flexibility in these new demands, right? Just in 2022 alone, US electric cars sold in 2022 averaged nearly 300-mile vehicle range. That's about 7 days of average Americans' daily commutes, right? So we don't need to plug in our vehicle every night. We don't need to charge it to full every night. We can charge it maybe once a week for the typical driving patterns. And we certainly don't need to all come home and plug in at 6 p.m. and drive the evening peak off the charts, right? That's the natural response of somebody who doesn't know anything about electricity incentives, or we're not passing on any carrots for joining smart charging programs, anything like that. And so we can reshape this kind of demand pattern into something that looks much more manageable. These EVs offer an enormous amount of flexibility to shift charging patterns overnight or through the daytime. If we can install daytime chargers, that'll be key in solar-dominated places like California or Colorado, and even to shift which days of the week we charge, right? These are big big batteries with incredible amounts of flexibility. But that flexibility will only be tapped if properly incentivized. So this is where utility programs, rate design, aggregators, smart business models that can aggregate and unlock the flexibility of these loads are absolutely critical to get ahead of the challenges that are coming down the line. So we need to think just as much about operational strategies and incentives for consumers as we think about building out the physical infrastructure to tap this. And if we do so, we can substantially reduce the peak demand. So in a study for New Jersey, we estimated that just a modest amount of EV flexibility, only 50% of the fleet signing up for some kind of flexible charging program, and 20% of hot water heater demand, that's a pretty modest level of penetration for flexibility by 2050, could reduce peak demands in New Jersey by about 17%. So nearly a fifth of the peak demand could be eliminated by unlocking flexibility from just EVs and hot water heaters, let alone heat pumps or greater levels of EV flexibility. That's a 6 gigawatt reduction in just New Jersey alone, similar scale across all of PJM that we looked at in this study. Now, I want to emphasize, though, that we have nothing like the incentives for this program right now. I just bought an EV in December last year. It has a 290-mile range, right? We could charge it once a week. We can choose when we charge it. The incentive program that PSEG, my local utility, offers, first of all, requires like a 12-point form to go through, along with inspection from the city of our charger, which is what's holding me up from actually completing the process. And then we get a whopping 2 cents per kilowatt hour incentive to charge between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. or something like that. So no smart charging, no managed charging, just don't charge in the evening or the daytime. And I get a 2 cents a kilowatt hour discount, which is barely worth the effort to go through it. Right? The only reason I'm doing is you also get some money off of your electrical upgrades for the house, which is a much bigger incentive. Now, I've heard of pilot programs from Excel here in Colorado and Minnesota that offer unlimited monthly charging for about $30 a month if you sign up for their managed charging program. So could you imagine getting a $30 a month gas card, right? You can go to the gas station and charge for $30 a month, fill up as much as you want, right? That's an incredible incentive, right, for anybody with an EV to reduce their cost of fueling. And the catch is that you have to sign up for a smart charging program. So when you plug in your vehicle, you tell it, I need this much range in the morning. I need 80 miles of range to get to work and back. And it will decide, along with all of the other vehicles in the neighborhood, when to charge your vehicle, right? So we can coordinate not just your charging, but across a whole fleet to reduce strain on distribution network components, to reduce strain on peak demand for generation components, et cetera, right? So these, automation, computing, incentive programs, these are getting cheaper and easier every day, but we need creativity in business models and incentives to unlock the inherent flexibility that we have in these new loads. Now, whatever level we do adopt in terms of flexibility, we can reduce, again, by maybe a fifth or a quarter, the total amount of growth. But remember, back a few slides, I'm talking about 150% increase in demand for electricity. So no matter what we do need to build, right? We need to get back into a mindset in this industry of expansion of infrastructure, right? We need to be thinking proactively, getting ahead of the curve, and building out the physical infrastructure we need to serve this, whether that's generation or transmission or distribution assets, or the communications and controls equipment that we need to unlock that flexibility. Now, this may all seem daunting. I'd like to throw a little propaganda out at the end of my talk, because I think we all need a little more propaganda in our lives, right? You can look at these charts and you say, holy cow, how are we ever going to do that, right? You can look at barriers, and we are here, I think, at this meeting and many others around the country all the time to look with a very clear eye at what those barriers look like. But we can look at barriers and we can see insurmountable obstacles, or we can look at challenges that this industry can and will solve that make this probably the most exciting business to be in for the next 3 decades, right? So I hope that you'll take away this spirit from the talk, right? Not the daunting, insurmountable challenge, but the critical challenge that we as an industry need to solve for the sake of the country, right? For the sake of building a better America, right? A better America with more reliable supply, with, severed from the vulnerabilities to global commodity market shocks and the whims of dictators on the other side of the world that might start a war at a moment's notice and affect gas prices here in Denver overnight, right? We can get off that crazy roller coaster. We can clean the air, dramatically improving the quality of air quality by electrifying and getting off of fossil combustion. And we can get on a path to address climate change, right? So let's overcome these challenges. Let's focus very clearly on what they are. We don't need to be Pollyannish about this, but we also don't need to be Cassandras. So take that spirit away for the rest of the day. And thanks for having me join you this morning.
to invite up to the podium John Black from ISO New England. John is the manager of load forecasting and system planning and provides technical direction for energy analytics in both short-term and long-term load forecasting. His team forecasts the electric sector impacts of various distributed energy resources, including energy efficiency, photovoltaics, and those related to the electrification of buildings and transportation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to John.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Thumbs up? Okay, because Debbie, you were a little faint. Try to move this up a little bit. We could hear you, but you're a little faint. Thank you, ESIG, for inviting me to speak here. You know, I would actually prefer to not be speaking because as is always the case when I'm here at ESIG, I'm here to learn. But so hopefully you learned something from this presentation. If you asked me 5 years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, the last time I was at an ESIG conference, that there would be a focused conference on long-term load forecasting, I would have been in utter disbelief. But given all that we just heard from Jesse and the pace of changes that we're anticipating in the industry, it makes a lot of sense. ESIG is always a very, very wonderful technical forum for solving real challenges. So I'm really happy and feel blessed that ESIG is taking this on, and I look forward to the future work that we'll be doing together. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview. I mean, I'm going to basically try to say too much in too little time. I'm going to talk about an intro to load forecasting, mainly talking about how we at ISO New England do long-term load forecasting. It's not the only way to do load forecasting. And I imagine that the way we do load forecasting will need to change considerably in the coming years as we continue to innovate and advance our methodology. But so I'll talk a little bit about our methodology and then talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we're aware of and thoughts about how to address those challenges in the future. Now, again, we are an ISO RTO. So the vantage point that I'll be talking from is long-term load forecasting from a grid operator, you know, a transmission service provider, and a wholesale market, you know, designer and administrator. So, you know, we're not going to be diving down into the bowels of the distribution system, thinking of individual homes basis, stuff like that. We're generally kind of more top down, but as you'll find out in this presentation, we're kind of transitioning to more looking bottom up in certain ways, particularly for the factors that will be changing how we use electricity in the end use sector. So I'll skip a lot of this initial content just for time purposes, but so long-term load forecasting, what is it and why does it matter? Essentially, the results of our work is the foundation of all planning studies. It's utterly the foundation, one of the most important assumptions and sets of assumptions, foundational to all sorts of planning studies. And one of the interesting things that, you know, I've been doing this for maybe 10 years almost. One of the interesting thing is, you know, what we focus on as forecasters is changing quite quickly. You know, when I started working, it was more, you know, what are the seasonal peaks? What's the annual energy? And now we're diving down into much more granular load characteristics, which I imagine we'll continue to do as the grid continues to evolve. But long-term load forecasters at ISO New England, foremost, are critical to that foundational set of assumptions that inform our administration of the forward capacity market, as well as transmission planning, needs assessments, reliability assessments, economic studies, scenario analyses. We're doing a lot of work looking out in years 2040, 2050. And of course, you need to have some scenarios for what the load is going to look like in those future conditions. Generator interconnection, and also, you know, long-term outage coordination. Basically, what's the peak load exposure at certain times of year? How does that shift seasonally? to make sure that you can coordinate outages of generators and transmission lines and things like that while maintaining a reliable grid. Our forecast, we're at it every year, and we're in production mode probably 6 to 8 months a year, and then the balance is, you know, a mixture of mostly R&D, and then other stuff that we have to do, not just developing the load forecast. So each year, our 10-year forecast looks out. So we're looking out, focused this so far to date. Our long-term load forecast really focuses on looking 10 years in the future. As I'll mention later, that's changing as well. And we publish it every year in our annual CELT report, we call it. So how we do it essentially is we model what we call gross load. Think of it as the base load, the stuff that isn't changing too much, a lot of weather sensitivity kind of encapsulated in the way that we use loads today. And then we adjust what those econometric model forecasts are based on some of the, you know, most important things that are changing our load characteristics in the future. So we've developed separate energy efficiency forecasts. We've been doing that for 11 years. Distributed energy resource, mainly DER PV or behind the meter PV. We started that about 9 years ago. And past 4 years, we've been forecasting both heating and transportation electrification. So model the base load and then adjust those model outputs based on the exogenous forecast outputs that I just enumerated. And I'll be touching upon very briefly some of these exogenous forecasts. So essentially, already our forecast methodology has changed considerably over the past decade. There's a greater emphasis on, you know, looking at policies, how policies are shaping our grid load. Uncertainty is coming from more sources, therefore, and we're not just forecasting demand anymore. There's things like, you know, load masking of DER PV. We need to really kind of capture what the net load characteristics are based on that load masking. We've already been doing more modeling, looking at more emerging trends, rather than relying purely on statistical or econometric modeling like we were doing prior to the past decade, for a while anyway. So more layers, more accounting. And so this is where some of the forecasting challenges emerge. But some of our biggest hurdles to overcome is our understanding these emerging trends and how to model them. What are the important characteristics of these emerging trends that we need to build data pipelines for and model to end up with some kind of realistic output. A lot of methodology development, like I just said. And then, you know, the important one that's always sneaky. I talked about ways our long-term load forecast is used. How we impact, how changes to our forecast methodology and our finished forecast work products impact our downstream users, whether that's in transmission planning or in our administration of the forward capacity market. That is a very, very important characteristic. Each downstream use has a specific need that, you know, they're basically developing assumptions based on our forecast outputs, and we need to kind of work with them so that, you know, we don't want to forecast in a vacuum. In order for the forecast to be used, in order for them to be impactful, our downstream users need to be kind of kept in the loop. And there's an array of data availability constraints. Think of like all the emerging trends, and we're starting to have to get, you know, EV registration data and things like that we never even had to think about just a few years ago. This is a high-level flow chart. I'm not going to go through it in detail. Mostly it's just for folks to be able to look at this presentation after, but just kind of gives you a high-level summary of our whole process flow. You know, at the top you have you know, the inputs, whether they're historical data. We need to account for historical behind the meter PV. We need to account for passive and active demand resources. There's a lot of accounting that's actually extra in the long-term forecasting world, because if you're feeding markets, in our case, where passive demand resources are participating in supply in the marketplace. So we need to make sure those aren't double counted, and we have taken on the burden of making sure that that accounting is whole via the demand forecast that we produce. So we use a lot of historical load, historical weather, and modeling both energy and demand. Macroeconomic outlook is obviously a factor. We capture that in our energy models, our energy modeling outputs, and our energy forecasts are an input into our demand forecast. And at the end of all these model outputs is when we make all these adjustments based on the exogenous forecasts. A little bit more detail about the demand modeling, how we do it. We are to date still just doing daily peaks, modeling daily peaks. And I see that as probably a constraint that we need to change how we do the model and probably switch to more hourly modeling in the future, but still today we're doing daily peak modeling. And again, you're using historical weather, historical data in the model estimation process. And then I'll talk a little bit on the subsequent slides about, how we take those models and develop probabilistic forecasts from those. So in terms of developing weather scenarios, at this point, we have estimated energy models, we have estimated demand models on the demand side, daily peak models. Once again, how we create a probabilistic demand forecast is we use historical weather and we develop weather scenarios, basically based on 30 years of weather history, week by week. What is the total variance of possible weather conditions in any week across the year? And this is a little bit more detailed, but basically we take a window of days for each of the 30 years that are meant to represent each week. The weather that appears in one week could just as easily appear the week before or the week after based on, how the weather happens. So shown here, basically there's a swath of 25 daily weather points that were calculated or gathering up each year times 30, 750 weather points per year. And that in turn yields us the weather distribution shown on the bottom here. And this would be for an individual week. And this is weighted temperature humidity index is the key input variable to our summer seasonal peak demand models. We take those weather distributions week by week, we pass them through our peak demand model. Shown here is our July peak models. We actually estimate our models uniquely for each week of the year, each month of the year rather. And then out the other side, you see so weather goes in, and then if I can get this to work correctly, on the other side, you see these are load distributions, week by week, unique load distributions. And then what you end up with here, and this is just showing the first several years of our forecast, which again extends out 10 years. You end up with these load forecast peak demand distributions week by week. So you see this box plot of the variance in load. You see this is the base gross demand today. You see the greatest variance in load today is in the summertime. And we know that's about to change based on some of the discussion that Jesse covered in his presentation. In terms of which points in our load forecast distribution are most important, that varies again based on what the downstream use is. If you're talking transmission planning for needs assessments, reliability assessments like that, they generally are using what we refer to as our 90-10 peak demand forecast. And basically, this is the full distribution shown here on this slide. And the top 10% slice is really what we think of as the peak eliciting portion of the overall distribution. What the average load is in any particular week is generally not necessarily of interest when you're trying to do a planning study for summer peak conditions or something like that. So transmission planning generally uses 90-10, a little bit more of an extreme weather sort of assumption. But a lot of downstream users like transmission planning tend to use discrete points in a distribution for summer peak, winter peak, what have you. Other planning studies, particularly resource adequacy, use probabilistic inputs. And so really what that means is you need to capture the load forecast uncertainty, LFU, as it's often referred to in the industry. And the way we do it with developing these weekly probabilistic peak demand forecasts is you can calculate that LFU directly from the resulting load distribution, and that's needed for reliability assessments. So depending on the downstream user, we basically have to tailor our downstream work products to meet the needs of each downstream user. Heating electrification, again, this is one slide, and this is our new methodology as of this past forecast cycle. Basically, on a high level, we've leveraged all the great work that the National Renewable Energy Lab did, developing the Redstock and Comstock data sets, and basically started by doing total holistic comprehensive building characterization, understanding all the variants in the building stock that exists today, how they use heat, what the heating and air conditioning delivery systems look like, what the legacy fuels are. And then from there, develop an array of heating pathways. Think of pathways as, you know, a ductless, cold climate air source heat pump in a mobile home would be a heating pathway. So we have, on the building stock characterization, we have 5 residential building types and 14 commercial building types. Now, this is simplified a bit just to kind of capture the most salient features of the existing building stock to use in our modeling and development of heating pathways. And then, you know, we wanted to capture an array of different technologies via these heating pathways. So we have ducted and ductless air source heat pumps. We have air to water heat pumps. We have ground source heat pumps. We wanted to capture kind of, there's so much uncertainty, you know, we're just starting to see this uptake and adoption. We wanted to have the modeling capabilities of, you know, modeling what the potential impacts would be of different scenarios, depending on what the future adoption patterns look like. And then we get to the modeling. So the hourly demand modeling. So we are modeling heat and electrification at the hourly level. We're not doing daily peaks. And again, you have to have separate models for each combination of building type and heating pathway. So air source heat pump, mobile home, we have hourly models for those. Same thing on the commercial side of things. So a lot more bottom-up type of approach for our heating electrification forecasts. And again, I think this was based on the need that we have, trying to gear up for the future that we're embarking towards. On the transportation side, again, this is a single slide of our, you know, rather detailed methodology. But essentially, we've canvassed all of the state policies, federal policies, but there's been a lot of activity on the state level for developing, you know, near-term goals and mandates and programs. So Victoria Rojo is the lead of the transportation electrification forecast. She's in the crowd here today, so please, I encourage you to speak with her if you have questions. But Victoria canvassed all policies and basically wanted to make sure that based on just the policy outlook, if we met all the policies, what would adoption look like? And then from there, we kind of made a little bit more reasonable assumptions, slightly more reasonable assumptions to reflect some uncertainty in the timing of the goal achievement and the extent of electrification from there. So that's on the adoption side, how we've done it state by state. On the modeling side, you see there's some details here that you may not be able to see from the back of the room. But basically the key features we wanted to capture were, we definitely wanted to capture the weather sensitivity, noting that the, you know, battery management systems, the space, cabin heating and cooling requirements basically change the relationship between, you know, charging needs and weather. So we've captured that via an efficiency curve shown here. As the temperatures get really cold or really hot, basically you're going to need more kWhs per mile. We have some assumptions about vehicle miles traveled. I think those assumptions are going to advance in the future. And then from there, we have hourly shapes where we're allocating daily charging energy required based on this weather on any particular day, allocating that daily energy to individual hours. And we've done that for 5 different vehicle classes that we develop unique forecasts for: light duty personal, light duty fleet, medium duty delivery, school buses, and transit buses. Really, the light duty personal vehicles drive most of the results in our forecast, just sheer numbers of vehicles on the road. But that's how we're doing it today. We are not yet reflecting managed charging assumptions yet. That's something that we're actively working on. The states and the utilities, are still in relatively nascent stages of developing time of use rates and what these programs are going to look like. And as forecasters, we like to have a little bit more, want to do something that has a little bit more of a known quantity. So we've been waiting for those to take shape a little bit. I think maybe by next year or the year after, we'll have some starting assumptions regarding managed charging. In terms of overall adoption, you see the same 5 different vehicle classes, and you see there's a gray line up on the top of each one of these plots here. That's basically if all the policies are achieved, assuming that electrification is the sole way of reaching the long-term decarbonization goals and of each of the individual states. So that's basically what we call our full electrification scenario. And we really wanted to use that as an upper bound, like a benchmark of what our ultimate adoption forecasts look like with respect to that total, complete full adoption scenario. So you see both here. And one thing to note is, the dark solid lines are this year's forecasts, and the dashed lines shown are last year's adoption forecasts. And one of the things that changed remarkably this year is we've increased our adoption forecast, partly because of, the IRA and also just because we've been able to talk more seriously. We work close with the New England states, state by state, in sort of talking through what our assumptions are, what they should be, if there's changes that are needed. And this year, I think we got down to brass tacks a little bit more in our conversations, especially looking at the policies and being able to say, hey, this is what your policies are saying if you read every letter and all the words of your policies. So anyway, we had a very productive forecast cycle, and I think our adoption forecast this year is certainly much more aggressive than in prior years, and we'll have to wait and see what the pace of adoption ends up looking like. And what it all means in terms of our final forecast outputs. Again, really our electrification is driving a lot of discussions in our forecasts right now. I think they've kind of taken center stage this year. And so what I'm showing here is, on the top set of plots is just the electrification slice. Those 2 exogenous forecasts. And then left to right, you see annual energy, summer peak demand in the middle, winter peak demand on the right. So in New England, we have 25 gigawatts of summer peak demand today. All-time peak was a little bit north of 28 gigawatts, but that was 15, 16 years ago. So just to give you a scale, a sense of the size of the system, 25 gigawatts peak today, summer seasonal peak, winter peaks are generally around 20 gigawatts. They're not as high. We don't have as much electrified heating yet today. So give you a sense of the scale, we're forecasting, north of 6 gigawatts of winter peak demand if you combine our transportation and heating electrification forecasts in the winter. So just looking out 10 years, the scale of the changes that we're forecasting are quite dramatic. Out 10 years, we're not forecasting a winter peaking system. I think that happens by the mid 2030s, but certainly there's a very, very remarkable convergence if you look at our forecast between winter and summer peak over the 10 years. As you can see on the bottom plots, which are actually our net energy on the left, and then net summer and winter demand in the center and right, respectively. Here you see, we're talking about maybe 27,000 megawatts out 10 years for summer peak demand. We're getting north of 26,000 megawatts. So the differential is really not that significant out 10 years in our forecast. We forecast, as I said, DER PV. There's a lot of detail here, trying to cut to the chase here, but essentially for long-term forecasting purposes, what we refer to as behind the meter is anything that does not participate in wholesale markets. So that is not all DER PV. We have particularly megawatt scale stuff that participates as settlement only resources in our wholesale energy market. That is not behind the meter, but it is in real time. We don't have telemetry from those resources. So when you talk about operations forecasting, almost our total DER PV forecast is behind the meter. The graphic I meant to include here just to show the scale of the changes just in our DER PV forecast. We started, admittedly very conservatively 10 years ago, forecasting out, 1,800 megawatts by, the mid 2020. So about today, we would have said about 1,800 megawatts. Today, we're approaching 6,000 megawatts of DER PV installed. So year over year, our forecast, at least for the first 7-8 years, we were seeing sizable upticks in our total nameplate DER PV forecast. And that was largely because of our methodology. We're reading the tea leaves of the policies. That's our methodology to date. We're looking at, Massachusetts SMART program. What's the policy goal? What's the recent pace of adoption? So that's our methodology today. I do think that we were in great need to move to a more model-based DER forecast methodology. We're considering NREL's DGen model as a candidate option to capture not only some of the changing patterns. We're hearing, at least anecdotally, that there's parts of our region that now, without policy support, maybe just net metering, those are incentivized enough, and they don't need the policies that we're using as the basis of our forecast. So, we're considering ways to, more comprehensively forecast DER PV. I will say, in terms of visibility, one of the things that I would like NREL, DOE, ESIG to be more mindful of is we need data, what these PV systems are doing out there. And this may not be as important for long-term forecasting, but it is very important for system operations forecasting. I mean, we're starting to really wrestling with questions for our EMS system modeling of these systems, where we have parts of our system that are injecting power back into our distribution system. And we don't even know today, right now, how much PV is installed at an individual substation. We're collecting data town level, what town, every installation we're getting data on, but what town is it installed in? What's the AC nameplate capacity? What's the in-service date? Those are basically the parameters that we're collecting. We started 10 years ago working directly with the distribution owners to gather this data. But now we're going through the process of taking that more geographical locational data and going back to the distribution owners and saying, wait, we need to map this by network bus or substations, right? Because that's where our purview ends, down to the T&D interface is basically where our world ends, and the distribution utilities, distribution owners begin. So there's a lot of activity that's happening already in our region, and I think we need to do a lot as an industry to make sure that we have the data that we need and the tools that we need to plan and operate the system effectively. And again, so now I just said the T&D interface. So we develop our long-term load forecast out 10 years, and all of our modeling is done at the state level. And then how we go from state down to various subregions. We have ISO New England load zones. We're talking about RSP sub areas, all these sub-regional divisions that are not clear-cut state boundaries. How we do that today is via the network model process. ISO has an annual multi-regional modeling working group where they're interfacing with the transmission owners. And so what we do is we take our state level forecasts, we divide that into operating companies based on basically load shares over the last few years, average load shares. We take our forecast, now we have it at the operating company level, and then they give us snapshots, year 1 of our forecast, year 10 of our forecast horizon, of what the their bus by bus forecast of megawatts are. And we don't use those megawatt values on their face. We take our, subdivided the state level forecast totals And this is how we allocate those megawatts to buses. Now, there's a lot that's going to need to happen in the future. You know, there's a lot of more dynamic activity and discussions happening in this network model creation process. We're basically going to need more data, different data than we're getting today, to basically make sure that we're getting a good read of bus by bus allocations of what our forecast should look like at that more granular level. But again, this is part of the annual process that we go through. Now beginning to look at, you know, the scale of the changes that, you know, we're starting to see and certainly we're going to see in the future. The left-hand plot is something that, you know, at this point is pretty firmly baked into ISO New England's thinking, because we've been dealing with this DERPV growth for years now. But, you know, as an example of a new load characteristic that's worthy of really focused attention, what's the midday minimum load going to be at some future state of the system, right? We have minimum generation emergencies that we call them min-gen emergencies. Basically, we have a generation online, think nuclear power plants, that we don't want to back down. And, you know, we have about 3,000 megawatts of that. Once we start, and then we have, you know, another layer of other resources, essentially somewhere in the 3 to 4 gigawatt demand level, it starts causing, you know, voltage concerns, high voltage issues, things like that. And so our transmission planning group is really focused on understanding this, right? Because they need to factor this into the needs assessment. It's not just about system peak anymore, building out the transmission. Now you have line compensation to meet the voltage issues that might be on the system at any particular future point in time. So what we're forecasting today is basically, you know, minimum midday loads in New England out 10 years of less than 2 gigawatts and quickly approaching zero. And under the hood of that, we're going to have parts of our region that are net exporters of power. So in terms of the dynamics in the power flows, again, our forecasts is sort of foundational to sort of being able to analyze and study those types of future scenarios. The right-hand plot looking at electrification, this is kind of getting back to what Jesse already kind of teed up. I did this just for daily energy, just to give you a sense, because, you know, we're not worried about peak demand, but just daily load energy. The black is the variance in the wintertime, January weekday load variance today, load energy. So here we are, we're maybe 300 gigawatt hours to, you know, maybe 450 gigawatt hour variance. Now you add in electrification. This is a very sort of simple, just sort of, you know, thumb in the air analysis here. So don't dive into the specifics too granularly. But you start adding our electrification forecasts out now to mid-century, and you end up by mid-century seeing this variance, not only the magnitude double, triple in terms of the daily load energy, but the variance because of the increased weather sensitivity that heating electrification in particular, but also transportation electrification will be sort of resulting on the system. You know, this is a dramatic range of possible load scenarios in a January analysis, which is important for ISO New England. We have energy adequacy concerns. More strategically, or for our organization, we've distilled sort of how do we successfully transition to this future grid where there's all this clean energy and we have these emerging trends that are going to reach, you know, these very, very high decarbonization goals out but mid-century. So on the left, you see significant amounts of clean energy. We heard Jesse talk about that. I see our forecast as foundational to all of these things. Again, in thinking about the future grid, we as long-term load forecasters need to be very prudent and oftentimes very creative about how we provide the underpinning sort of assumptions for, you know, how we're thinking about this future grid. So, we're forecasting DER PV. That's going to be part of the clean energy transition. In terms of balancing resources, this is where those new load characteristics that are becoming increasingly important. Midday min load, ramping requirements, things of this nature. That's certainly going to inform our future expectations regarding balancing resources. And then energy adequacy, sort of the plot that I just showed. How much energy are we going to need during a 3-day cold snap in 2050? Of course, energy adequacy is I think, I don't know, very, very, very core to a lot of the ISO New England's work. And then I already talked about how load forecasts feed transmission planning. And lastly, I'll steal a page from Jesse's presentation. I like build, 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 because I think we're going to be doing the exact same thing as forecasters. So again, I just talked about how we're doing forecasting today. I think we've already seen significant changes to our methodology, but I think, use the cliche, we ain't seen nothing yet. So we're going to have to innovate and be creative, and there's going to be continuous enhancements to all of our forecasting processes. We're going to need more data, more modeling, honestly, probably different skill set for my team in particular, more and more reliance on data science, things of that nature. In terms of specifics, methodologically speaking, that we're considering to better position ourselves for this future grid, we would like to switch from historical weather data to climate projection data, right? So we want to stick with hourly data. We have some data based on work that we've done with EPRI that we might be able to plug into basically our existing methodology in some way. And so that's something that we're strongly considering in the near term. We're going to need to expand our DER forecast, as I already said, not only methodologically switching to a more model-based process that can capture more sort of factors than just policies, but also, we're starting to see significant uptick of DER storage, both standalone DER storage and co-located DER storage. Now, part of that is certainly attributed to state policies, but how do we forecast that? How do we know how much is going to participate in the markets versus be behind the meter and load reducing from a long-term load forecasting perspective? And certainly, our top-down econometric modeling, just focusing on daily peaks, will need to advance. One of the things we're considering is certainly switching to hourly modeling, so we can capture sort of the load shape impacts of that base load and its evolution, and layer on top of that all those exogenous forecasts, which then also will need to be hourly, some of which already are, the electrification forecasts in particular, so that we can get these load shape impacts. We're doing this in ways that I didn't talk about today because it's too weedy. We're doing this as, sort of nimble forecasters to do a decent job, but I think we're going to have to do it rather explicitly in the future. And moving towards this hourly modeling, I think, is going to dramatically change what's in our models, what our models look like. One of the things that we've been thinking about is maybe pivoting more towards short-term load forecast modeling in terms of model specification, maybe using machine learning, AI, so that they can capture more of the weather and calendar effects more granularly, so we can simulate 2050 hourly loads based on weather-based load profile and reflect the calendar. That might be really important. And in fact, we're already hearing from our scenario analysts that, this is what they need. And, we're getting there, but we're not quite there yet. Certainly our 10-year forecast horizon is already changing. Our electrification forecasts are going up to 2050. We certainly are going to need to look out beyond 10 years. So we need to sync up all of our forecast outputs so that we can comprehensively cover, 20 plus years, I'd say maybe 30 years, so that we can get to this mid-century, target for a lot of these decarbonization goals and get what load is going to look like. And then lastly, I mentioned the load forecast uncertainty today, how it's really done. It's really what's the variance in the weather that's going to happen at any particular time of year. Now, anybody who's, has a couple synapses firing together would say, well, geez, John, all that stuff you just talked about, EV adoption, heat pump adoption, there's uncertainty there, right? well, this is something that's not baked into our processes and our thinking in terms of load forecast uncertainty in the future, that I think is going to become more and more important. And so, this is really the biggie, getting all of these forecasts to be more probabilistic in nature. All those exogenous forecasts today are just deterministic. How do we get everything in this probabilistic space? How do we map it all together to capture these other sources of uncertainty so that our downstream users can start factoring in that uncertainty better than we are capturing today? So this is what keeps me up at night, honestly. I think the pace and the scale of changes that we're going to need to do to keep pace with what's going on in the industry is accelerating along with the load changes that we're expecting to see. So thank you for your time and happy to answer questions.